Good morning, friends. Oh, one more thing here to do. Good morning, good morning, good morning to you.
Good
Great
morning.
to be together on this day, and I almost forgot to do that. So we're back. Woo! Welcome to another episode of PB Reads the Bible. What's that mean? Well, I'm PB. I'm the pastor here at CUMC, Christ UMC, in Waynesboro, PA, and well, once again, Facebook isn't giving us notifications, and I don't know why. I didn't change anything. Um, so I do hope that you're able to find us and get on here and all that, unless it's doing, nope, still not doing it. All righty. All right. Anyway, this is another episode of PB Reads the Bible, and it's episode 5 on our journey through the second half of Samuel, 2 Samuel. So we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapter 5 today. And great to be able to gather together in this way and do this thing together and live life together, share life together. Yeah, try to mute that. Excuse me one moment. All right, we're back. Allergies are acting up, and so I apologize for that. But we're going to get back to it. Today is Thursday, July 21st. So it's episode. Oh, Cheryl, you got a notification today. Wonderful. Good to hear. I don't know why I didn't. It's not showing up for me, but as long as it's showing up for others, that's good. And good morning, Maureen. Good to have you with us this morning. Good to be together. Great to be together. And now I know some folks will be joining us watching a recording some other time. They'll be watching the video some other time because they oh, Cindy didn't vote you. Good morning, John and Cindy. Okay, you guys didn't get a notification either. Okay, so Cheryl did. You didn't. I didn't. I don't know what's going on. Facebook. Anyway, so I know some folks can join live, some join at other times. In both cases, please check in. Do your romper room roll call. Let me know you're there, so that I can be in prayer for you and with you. So if you have things you want to be in prayer about, please let us know. You can use the comments section, or you can send me a text, 570-351-1619. Sounds right. And we will keep each other surrounded in prayer, lifted up in prayer as we go through that. But today is Thursday, the 21st. So this is going to be it for the week, friends. Tomorrow is Sabbath day, although part of my Sabbath is gone, is nixed, and that's all right. We'll have Saturday is Sue day, but I also might make it Sabbath day, do something for myself as well. Shh, don't tell her. And Sunday is worship, 8:15 and 10:45 in person. 10:45 worship experience is also live streamed on Facebook and YouTube and on our website. Good morning, Ron. Try and keep cool. Yes, indeed. Try and keep cool, folks. Wear hats, wear sunglasses, wear sunscreen if you're going outside, because not only is it hot, the burn rate is extremely high because of that in some other situations, and you will burn in 15 or 20 minutes. So please wear sunscreen and do it often, and drink lots of water. That cup's empty, so I'm going to reach down and grab my bottle. Just dip into this a little early. Looked like I was drinking out of the creek. Wouldn't be the first time, right? So for Sunday, if you're able to join us in person, please do so, 8:15 and 10:45. If you can't, or if you don't feel comfortable in doing so, for whatever reason, please know the first course, please know you would be welcomed here. But if you can't make it or whatever, join us online to worship with us. You're not a spectator, you're a participant. And go through, have stuff, make it sacred, make it special. Make it sacred, make it special. And you can check in now, right? Well, of course, you can always check in on Facebook and stuff, but we now have that digital connection card that folks can use to interact and connect with the church, to mark your attendance and also ask for prayers and stuff like that. Great that we're able to have that service, and that service isn't costing us anything. It's wonderful. Of course, they want you to buy some of their other services as well, which we're not doing right now. Anyway, so we're on the second half of Samuel. It's often referred to as Second Samuel, and we're looking at chapter 5 of Second Samuel as we do that, which is a little bit longer than yesterday's. A little bit longer than yesterday's, and do remember that yesterday Ishbosheth was killed, and David, the assassins thought they were bringing good news and were going to be rewarded, and they were rewarded with execution. So what happens as a result of all of this, right? Also remember the very beginning of chapter 4, it mentioned about, it reminded everyone about Abner's death at Joab's hands. And it mentioned that Ishbosheth was afraid. And we said that why he was afraid. He's just a very fearful man, and he was afraid of Abner, but now he's afraid for his life because he doesn't have Abner. Good morning, Marcia. Great to have you joining with us, being together today. But it also described the all of Israel. It said all Israel was dismayed, right? All Israel was dismayed, or all Israel became alarmed. All Israel was anxious and filled with angst and worried and concerned, nervous, afraid, whatever way you want to describe it. But it describes all Israel, not literally all Israel, but all the leaders of the northern tribes. Anyway. And in part because they no longer had Abner to be that intermediary to intercede on their behalf with David, and perhaps negotiate good terms for their surrender, so to speak. Okay, that's a big part of it, and we're going to see that in these just opening verses of this passage. So here we go. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron. Pause. And the context isn't the tribes, but the leaders of the tribes. The leaders of the tribes. So I'm going to reread that. Then all the tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom, came to David at Hebron and said, "Look, we are your bone and flesh. For some time while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. Yahweh said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel. You shall be ruler over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before Yahweh, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Pause. Now, obviously, the story doesn't specifically say it, right? But it's implied in the Hebrew, in the language, in the context, that when these leaders from Israel come to David, it's sort of like, what's that old expression? They came with hat in hand. They came practically groveling at David for mercy, we might say, because they had nothing to offer. They knew they know that they didn't have Abner to be that negotiator or to be a military defender. They also didn't have a king. They didn't have Ishbosheth anymore. So what are they going to do? All they can do is surrender to David and basically offer him nothing other than themselves. And so we have this, it's perfectly okay to have this image of them basically groveling and falling before David. Now, what's interesting about this passage? Multiple things. And so let's start with what they say. They say several things. They first off say, "We are your bone and flesh. We are your bone and flesh." Now, obviously not literally. Prior to this time, bone and flesh expression would have been limited to people from the same tribe. So Benjaminites would refer to each other as bone and flesh, and that would be it. Judahites would refer to each other as bone and flesh, and that would be it. So, and David does speak of the Judahites as being his bone and flesh in other places, and he's specifically talking about them. But this seems to be the first place where a tribe, or actually in this case, multiple tribes, are reaching out across those tribal boundaries to refer to anyone from any of the tribes of Israel to be bone and flesh. So they're pleading with David as a long distance cousin to have mercy on them, basically. He said, look, we are bone and flesh. Why should we continue to fight? Then they remind David and let David know, we remember. That's the best way to say it. They let David know that we remember everything that you did when Saul was king. It wasn't Saul that went out and came in before Israel. In other words, fought many battles. When the king was supposed to be going out with his troops, Saul wasn't doing it, and David was. And so they let David know, we remember that. We remember that. But they also say, we know what Yahweh said to you, that you will be shepherd of my people Israel. Boom. This is almost a mic drop, and this brings full circle for the reader, because we remember that David was the shepherd of sheep, and it has come full circle for him to now be shepherd of all of Israel. This child number 8 has been elevated to be shepherd of all of Israel, to be king. He's gone from the pastures to the throne, from sitting out in the in the wild to sitting on a throne in a palace. And then in verse 3, we see him finally being called King David. And these leaders of Israel, of the northern tribes, anoint David king over Israel. He was already king over Judah. Now he's king over Judah and Israel. And David made a covenant with them. There's that word again, that hesed, that he is going to be the loyal king to them. And then we get some numbers. Some details in there, that David was 30 I know I've said this numerous times, and I will continue to say it, that numbers are mostly symbolic in Hebrew literature, especially in the Old Testament, especially when you see rounded off numbers, so to speak. Number 40 is the big one. Number 40 is the big one. However, to paraphrase Freud, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes a number isn't meant to mean something else. Sometimes it's actually meant to mean that number. And it is quite possible that David was 30 years old when he became king over Judah and Israel, when he became king over all of the tribes of Israel, all 12 tribes. It's quite possible that he was 30. And based on many of the stories and other findings, it is quite possible that his reign was pretty close to approximately 40 years. Okay. At the very least, it was for a long time, which 40 typically means a long time or a generation. But in this case, it's probably not. If you want to read it literally this time, go ahead, because it's probably pretty close to how long David did reign. And it says that he reigned over from Hebron for 7.5 years and from Jerusalem for 33 years. Now, that's interesting because we haven't heard anything about Jerusalem yet. We haven't heard, this is the first we're hearing about Jerusalem. Because at this time, and we're going to find out this isn't much of a spoiler because we're going to get right into it, Jerusalem was not held by any of the tribes of Israel. Jerusalem was a possession, a city-state within the boundaries of Israel, occupied by the Jebusites. And we're not fully sure, we scholars, both biblical scholars and archaeologists, et cetera, aren't sure who the Jebusites were. If they were, like a tribe of Canaanites, or if they were just like a smaller group of Canaanites, whatever. But they were Canaanites. That's basically what we can agree to, is that they were Canaanites living in this place of Jerusalem, which means Jerusalem is city of peace. I think it's city of peace, town of peace. Anyway, it's Salem, S-A-L-E-M, means peace. So that, which is always interesting, I think, because of David and because of what happens. So picking up from there, verse 6, and this will be 6 to 10. The king and his men marched to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here. Even the blind and the lame will turn you back," thinking David cannot come in here. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. David had said on that day, "Whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates." Therefore it is said, "The blind and the lame shall not come into the house." David occupied the stronghold and named it the city of David. David built the city all around from the Millo inward, and David became greater and greater, for Yahweh, the God of hosts, was with him. Pause. All right. So now we understand that David and his men are marching against Jerusalem and against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of that land. We haven't been told anything before. We're not told why. All of a sudden, David turns his attention towards Jerusalem and towards these Jebusites. We're not given any of that information. Was there antimony between these two groups prior to this point? We don't know. All we know, it says David and the king and his men. Now, that is specific. That is specific. That is universally, or pretty much universally, interpreted as David's 600, shall we say, followers, those men who were with him all the time. Those men who went with him on various raiding parties, those men who fought with him and for him for all that time that David was living in exile. We are not talking about the entire army of Israel. We're not talking even about representatives from all of the tribes of Israel. This seems to be only David and his core group taking on this battle, this fight against the Jebusites and against Jerusalem. And yes, spoiler alert, they are victorious. And notice David names it the city of David. The author seems to be indicating that David and his special troops have conquered this city all on their own to maintain it as a royal stronghold, a place that is David's personal property. This is his town, his city, from which he will rule, but over which the rest of Israel had nothing to do with it. It's like it's David's personal city, hence the name, the city of David. We hear that term. I know I've always heard that term and just think it's a sort of an honorary thing that was attributed afterwards, like, because David is so awesome, let's name a city after him. No, he named the city after himself. The city of David it's kind of like him staking his claim on this property, putting up the flag of David, not the flag of Israel, the flag of David over this city, that it is his. Okay, so backing up just a little bit, back to second half of verse 6. Now, there is an expression in here that shows up 3 times, and it's obscure and it's weird, and we're not 100% sure why this comes up so many times. But it says, speaking about the blind and the lame, and it seems like it's happening for several different reasons. This expression comes up. First, the Jebusites use it. They say, David, you'll never come here. They think their city, their stronghold in particular, is unbeatable, that there's no way David and his men are going to be victorious. You're nothing compared to us. Even our blind and lame would be sufficient for holding you off. That's how good our defenses are. We don't need our best warriors. Hang on one second. We don't need our best warriors. Our blind and our lame will be enough to keep you from conquering this city. That seems to be what the Jebusites are saying with that. They're throwing this statement, this derisive comment David's way, and because they're thinking, it says right there, they're thinking David cannot come in here. Now the author in that next verse 7, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, which is now the city of David. Boom. An extremely brief, in fact, no details, right? In that verse, he just says, nonetheless, David took it. Most likely describing, the power of David and his men, and saying, this is it's an ironic statement, we might say, or, it's the complete opposite. In spite of how great they thought their city was, David captured it very quickly. So we can read that in there. Now, there's an interesting thing here. Whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, those whom David hates. Pause. We reread that. No, why? Because especially the word that is translated water shaft, I said this before, but just in case, I'm going to share it again. When you're translating a word from one language to another, something that helps is how many times the word is used. The more often a word is used, the easier it is to translate it, to figure out what it means, exactly what it means. Tree. Ooh. if the word tree is used, 3,000 times, then it's easy to figure out that the word tree, based on its use and the context, the words that are around it, it's easy to figure out that tree means that thing that's right behind my shoulder over here, right? It's easy to figure out that that's what a tree is. And when you're translating from one language to another, and the Hebrew word for tree is used 3,000 times, it's easy to figure out, okay, they're talking about that means tree. That means tree. This word that is translated in this place as water shaft only appears one other time in Scripture. It appears once in one of the Psalms. And in that case, it is translated, I believe it's translated as waterfall. Waterfall. In other documents, it is translated entirely differently. In other documents, it is translated entirely differently. So it's only used twice in the Bible. Once it's used as it's retranslated as waterfall, and in here it's keeping basically with that and says water shaft. In other documents, it has translated as grappling hooks or weapon, and even as male sexual organ in some sort of oath-taking ceremony. So we don't know really what, I mean, those are pretty wild and wide apart translations, right? One scholar, which is quite interesting, translates it as windpipe. Now, if we translate it as windpipe, let's look at that. Almost, it seems to be a directive, if it's translated as windpipe rather than water shaft. It seems to be a directive by David on how to attack the people inside Jerusalem and not leave any blind or lame. Basically, kill them all by striking their windpipe. Crack their windpipe, break their windpipe, and no one was going to be left lame and blind. And that's a valid, if that person is right with that translation anyway, which it seems that it could be translated that way. Now, going back to this translation, that water shaft, that both, and actually you can see in the NIV, there's a footnote that says scaling hooks. So we don't know what that word means. And those are pretty wide apart, a water shaft versus grappling hooks. But if we think of it as water shaft, as some people do, they read it as a description of how David took the city very stealthily by basically going up a pipe, entering into the city through an underground waterway, and coming up into the city. So that's a very valid explanation for it. It doesn't quite explain the about David wanting to attack the lame and the blind, because it doesn't seem to fit David's character. Whereas the other translation kind of fits a little bit better, but they both work. And that's how weird things get when we don't really know what a word means. If it's only used a couple times, we end up not having any idea what the word means. Okay. And then there seems to be an insertion by the author, by the editor, by the Deuteronomistic writer, whatever. That's why the blind and the lame shall not come into the house, which is very out of time and out of place, because the house, although some think palace, most scholars believe we're talking about the house of Yahweh. In other words, the temple, but the temple doesn't exist yet. And we really can't find any kind of a prohibition about the blind and the lame completely entering into the house, although there are some cases where that seems like that might have been the case, especially if we look at some of the stories in the New Testament with Jesus. The beggars are outside of the temple, and perhaps they were prevented from going in. Okay. So David occupied the stronghold, the core piece of within Jerusalem. Oh, and it does say early, and it is referred to as the stronghold of Zion. Zion is often thought of as one of the mountains right there on which Jerusalem sits, right around it. Jerusalem's almost a valley, and it does the term, and so that often becomes called the city of Zion. And it's also the Mount Zion is officially where Solomon does build the temple. But so David's stronghold is on. He occupies the stronghold, and he names it the city of David. And it speaks about him, how he builds up the city. Now there are some interesting things here, and or interesting things not here, that lead scholars to wonder and to think about it. And this is an interesting thought. It does not say that David put all the Jebusites to the sword, so to speak. It does not say that he killed everyone. It does not say that he forced them out of the city. So it is quite possible, if not probable, that David allowed them to stay in the city and actually put many of them into offices of administration, because the type of administration that David now needed to run the kingdom, none of the people of Israel, since it was such a tribal situation, would have any idea how to do it. But Jerusalem was much more of an administrative, political entity, and they probably had people who were capable of handling those functions. So it's quite possible that that's why David did not kill everybody, and instead actually put them to work for his administration, for his office. Interesting stuff, I think. All right. Picking up from there, verse 11. King Hiram of Tyre sent messengers to David. Tyre is actually north of the northern border of Israel, so it's not a town within Israel. It's outside of this. It's outside of Israel, and King Hiram of Tyre. So it was a city-state. King Hiram of Tyre sent messengers to David, along with cedar trees and carpenters and masons, who built David a house. David then perceived that Yahweh had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. In Jerusalem, after he came from Hebron, David took more concubines and wives, and more sons and daughters were born to David. These are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhiah, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphalet. Dave, Bob, Tim. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed, pause. Actually, I should pause there. So the authors, the editor, are describing the expansion, the solidifying of David's kingdom, and how his kingdom and his position as king is now being accepted by other political entities. And so King Hiram is sending gifts, including workers, to do things for David. Sort of part of like a treaty, we might say, at least in the hopes that David isn't going to want to try to expand his kingdom farther north, perhaps, and to build up that relationship. Yes, for self-protection, and also protection from others, not just from David, but from other parties. By doing this kind of thing, he's at least hoping, if not being assured, that David will come to his aid should he need it. Hey, remember that house I had built for you? That kind of thing. And so we're seeing that his kingdom is being more and more established, and he's becoming more and more powerful. And he recognizes that it is Yahweh. David does recognize that this is all coming from Yahweh. We're still not seeing David using violence for his position or to keep his position. We see his violence in capturing Jerusalem, perhaps, but Jerusalem wasn't part of Israel, and it's sitting right in the middle of Israel. So he's trying to get rid of a place that shouldn't be there, kind of thing. And now we're seeing this list. He's got more wives, more concubines, and more sons and daughters. And we're seeing this list of names popping up. And if not yet, we probably should start to be wondering about all these names and who's going to take over when David dies. Because this idea of succession is important, and it needs to be figured out. And with this many sons, we're like, no, there's going to be trouble. And of course there is. Continuing, when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up in search of David. Pause. Remember, we were never told that David officially left service to the Philistines, and may have been doing that, at least to an extent, or at least in name only, while he was in battle and in war against Ishbosheth, against the forces of Israel. And now they realize, wait a minute, he took us to the cleaners. He was lying to us all this time. Let's go get him. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. David inquired of Yahweh, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? Yahweh said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. So David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. He said, Yahweh has burst forth against my enemies before me like a bursting flood. Therefore, that place is called Baal Perazim, pause, which means Lord of bursting forth. Because remember, Baal at this point in particular means Lord, not specifically that Baal God. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. Pause, which is important to remember. We're going way back to like chapter 3 or 4. We learned about the importance of conquering and taking the other people's gods, their idols, because you're taking their power away. Continuing, once again, the Philistines came up and were spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So they regrouped and got more people. When David inquired of Yahweh, he said, Yahweh said, you shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come upon them opposite the balsam trees. When you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then be on the alert, for then Yahweh has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. David did just as Yahweh had commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines from Geba all the way to Gezer. End of chapter 5. Okay, so the first time that the Philistines come up, and David says, shall I go up against them? Which would be, this frontal attack. And God says, yep, absolutely, go ahead, do it. I will certainly put them into your hand. And that is what happens. And they're defeated, and the last of the Philistines run away. The second time, so they've regrouped, the Philistines have regrouped, got reinforcements, come back to attack, are all spread out. And this time, though, David says, hey, shall I go up against them? God says, no, don't go up against them. Go around to the back. Go around to the back. I want you to do a flanking maneuver and come around from behind them. And through this, and it's not described other than in the statement, some sort of a supernatural assistance. God says, when you hear this sound, that's going to be the time to start your fight, to attack from the rear. So, my friends, I do pray that this has been beneficial to you, that you have learned something or relearned something today, that this has been beneficial and that God has spoken to you in some way through what we said and what we've read today. As you go about your days, not just today, but every day, keep those eyes and ears open, both spiritual and physical, for everything that our living, loving act of God is doing in your life and in the lives of those around you. When you see it, when you hear it, say thank you, and then tell somebody about it. Until we meet again, my friends, be blessed. Be blessed. Bye.